Maybe we can start again with just a little bit of meditation. So sit, make sure you're comfortable. And again, first to kind of, like I said, like the mindfulness of breathing exercises, like a warm-up for meditation, like stretching out. So let's start with that. So we can kind of gently bring our attention to the breath. As we breathe in, we're aware of the present moment sensation of breathing in. As we breathe out, we're aware of the present moment sensations of breathing out. Whatever thoughts arise or feelings, you just kind of notice them, like you might notice a cloud passing by. You don't chase after it, you don't judge it. You just notice the thought and gently bring your attention back to the breath. Again, while we're in meditative mode, we'll do a little bit of loving kindness meditation. So again, we'll start with ourselves. Right? So first, you think loving thoughts towards yourself. May I be happy. May I be well. May I be safe. May I have peace. May I have joy. And while you're thinking those thoughts, you imagine from the center of your heart, light rays in the nature of love, filling your body, filling your torso, your head, your arms, your legs. And that light has an energy of warmth, of kindness, of acceptance, and of love. So you imagine that energy, that light energy, gradually filling up your whole body as you continue to think, may I be happy, may I be well, may I be safe, may I have peace, may I have joy. And now, while we're still thinking that way and imagining light filling us, we'll include first one person. So bring to mind somebody you like very much or care about or love, like a friend or a family member. Just like think of them or imagine them in front of you. And also you think, right, like, may they be happy. May we both be happy. May they also be well. May they also have peace. May they also have joy. May they also be safe. And as you're thinking that about them, you could imagine like light rays also radiating from your heart to them. You can imagine those light rays completely filling their body. You imagine that through that they can feel love, and they can feel the energy of love, like filling them up, keeping them, giving them happiness, giving them well-being, giving them safety, giving them peace, giving them joy. And those light rays coming from your heart are in the nature of those thoughts and those feelings of love for them. And so this love now fills you and fills the one you care about. Like surrounding both in happiness, well-being, and loving kindness. Then also bring to mind one person who you up to now have felt neutral about. Like you didn't even really deeply notice that person. You noticed them enough to notice they were there, but you didn't have a feeling for them yet. It could be somebody you passed in a store, or on the street. And you just start to think, may they also be happy. May they also be well. May they also be safe. May they also have peace. May they also have joy. And imagine the light rays coming from your heart, radiating to them. Filling and surrounding them so that they also feel loved, feel accepted, feel cherished. You can imagine that those light rays give them happiness, give them well-being, give them safety, give them feelings of deep peace and deep heartfelt joy. You take a moment to just feel the rays of loving kindness going from your heart to them. Those rays of love that cherish them and see them as precious, or express, connected to their preciousness. Because they also want to be happy. They also want not to suffer. And then finally, last step, bring to mind somebody who you would ordinarily, right now, think of as an enemy, or somebody you don't like. Somebody you're angry at, whether it's somebody in your workplace, or somebody from your personal life, or somebody in these days, politics, something like that. It's somebody who, when you think of them, you immediately usually feel, oh, I don't like them. And think, may they also practice here. May they also be happy. May they also be well. May they also be safe. May they also know peace. May they also know heartfelt joy. And then you practice also the light rays going from your heart to that person. Helping them to feel, or allowing them, or giving them a feeling of love. And the light rays are surrounding and filling that person. As they're filled up by the light rays, you can imagine that they feel happy. That it gives them happiness. Gives them genuine well-being. Gives them safety. Gives them peace. Gives them joy. So now you can imagine, right, that you're filled up with that light energy, and all three of those others are equally filled up, because they equally need happiness and want happiness. They equally don't want to suffer, just like each other, just like you. So you, the friend, the already we can come to a more interactive mode as you feel ready. One comment I'll make about that practice is actually in his various teachings on Lamrim, on the stages of the path to enlightenment. Lama Tsongkhapa makes an interesting psychological point, actually, where he says, if you want to cultivate love or compassion, he says, if you do a kind of vague general sense, like, oh, may all beings, may everyone be free from suffering, may everyone be happy. He's kind of says, he basically he doesn't use these words, but essentially he says, well, that's good, but you won't really make much progress, actually. He says you could do that for months or for years, and you'll become a little more loving, but then what will happen is, then you go out, and then when you'll still continue like to view strangers and sort of not really pay attention to them and not care about them. And then you'll still come across people you don't like and you won't like them. And he says, but if you pick specific individuals who really, in that day, bugged you, or somebody you passed by that day and just didn't notice, he says, if you base your practice on real people you've come across and you practice each day like that, he says, then after a while, you'll actually be loving to everybody. It's an interesting point. So he makes this point. He says, if you try to start off by just being loving to everybody in kind of a general way, you won't make very much progress. It won't be very powerful. He says it's much more powerful if when the person, somebody who actually annoyed you that day, and then you think about them and you cultivate love for them. Or, same thing, right? You go somewhere, it happens, right? You go somewhere and like, there's somebody, actually, it's strange, isn't it? Like you can think like, wow, I really didn't register that person as a person hardly. You just passed by somebody, and then they think, wow, that's not the practice of love, actually, right? Love notices people for their humanity. What Lama Tsongkhapa is saying there is we won't change those habits unless we really engage with each individual. And it's interesting, and part of what he's getting at is if you do that with one individual and another for months, then as you go out in your daily life, it's just like with mindfulness. If you practice mindfulness of the breathing, right? We know this from scientific evidence, right? If you practice mindfulness of your breathing, and then you go out in the world, but you do it every day, eventually you'll become more mindful as you go about life. And so this is the same thing, actually. If you practice loving kindness with specific individuals, then you'll actually become more deeply loving in a kind of more heartfelt, genuine way that will permeate your life in a different way than if you just do it generically. So I thought that was a very practical point that was so common. And then, so part of the topic for today was like healing anger and finding joy, right? And so that's why I thought, it's good to start with the one that includes the enemy, because it starts to stir that up. Right? And part of the point is this, that's, actually, I'll start with this. There are many, Buddhism, Buddhist teachings have so many, I was starting to think about it, I was like, wow, there's just so many teachings on patience as an antidote to anger. Like, how do you decrease your anger? It's like a humongous topic in Buddhist psychology. There's so many different methods. And part of the reason there are so many different methods, of course, is we're all different people, right? And actually, not just are we different, but each day, from my own experience, I can say there's a method, if I try a method one day, I'm like, wow, that really helped. And then like another, 2 weeks later, if I get angry, and then I try that method, then it's like, well, that doesn't do anything for me. So you need a lot of different options, to work with when something really, like when it's like, there's some kinds of things where it's just like a little bit of annoyance, but then there's something where it gets under you, it's like a hook, right? It hooks you. And then when that happens, you need like a lot of options, right, to work with. And that's what Buddhism provides. It's quite extensive on that topic. But I'll say this, like the first, actually, if you look at, and I'm going to, I'll use a little bit of some teachings from mind training, in Tibetan Lojong mind training, and then I'll mainly talk a lot, there's a very famous, actually, the Dalai Lama, His Dalai Lama often comments on it, a chapter on patience in Shanti Deva's Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life. And it's often taught because it's very detailed in its psychological analysis of patience. But then there are many, many texts that teach about patience, and they're all good. But most of those texts, and Shantideva's one, they make, and actually I'll say, like, if we want to work with anger, right, and develop patience, one thing we have to do is understand, well, why? Like, and, because actually, like, there are people who, there are people actually who are, like, actually there are people who are I don't want to say like exactly, maybe like, but who are attached to their own anger, right? And so Shantideva goes through a long kind of description where he says about the disadvantages of anger. Actually, one thing that's kind of helpful on that point is that now, like, actually, there's a lot of scientific evidence that says the same stuff, right? Like, actually, they might be able to show. I'll just go on this little aside here. This was interesting. They actually did one study where they were monitoring people's heart rate, like their actual not heart rate, but cardiac function, and then they would have the person think of something that made them angry, and they could actually watch the heart change the way it beats into a less healthy pattern. I was like, wow, that's interesting. And then have the person like calm down, and then the heart got back to its healthier. And there's lots of evidence that anger has a lot of negative health effects. So that's one, right? In terms of our blood pressure, and cortisol levels, and stress hormones, and so all kinds of negative health effects. Shantideva goes through a whole analysis, and I mentioned this a little bit last night, where he says actually anger comes from mental unhappiness. Right? So he makes it actually. I should make I'll find that quick, because we'll go into a little more detail about it as we go along. Actually, I'll read this. I'll read a section of his, a few verses actually. But actually, Shantideva, he starts with the disadvantages of anger, and actually, he starts with the karma teaching. And he says, whatever wholesome or virtuous deeds, such as venerating the Buddhas, being generous, and so on, that have been amassed over 1,000 eons, will be destroyed in one moment of anger. That's the Buddhist karma teaching. And then, actually, it's interesting, one commentary I read, different lamas were debating, and they were saying, well, because 1,000 eons, that's a really long time. And then some lamas said, that's if you become angry at a bodhisattva. One moment of anger at a bodhisattva, they say. And then they said, if you become angry at an ordinary person, it's only 100 eons. I don't know if that makes you feel better, but that's not still not that's a teaching on karma. What they're getting at there, though, is like, actually, he goes on. He says, there is no evil like hatred, and no fortitude like patience. Thus I shall strive in various ways to meditate on patience. My mind will not experience peace if it fosters painful thoughts of hatred. I shall find no joy or happiness. Unable to sleep, I will feel unsettled. And then he goes on to describe how anger ruins relationships. And so part of what he's getting at, actually, I mean, one point he's making a lot of different points as he goes along. So one is, from a Buddhist perspective, the karmic, actually, I'll say it this way, the karma of love and compassion is the best kind of karma. Actually, even the word compassion, I always like this. The word compassion in Tibetan is Ning Jay. So Ning means heart, and Jay is the most exalted. So like compassion, they say, in the Tibetan word for it even, is the most exalted state of your heart. It's a beautiful word. And then from that, so that and any action done out of compassion, they say it has like humongous karmic benefit. But then an action done out of, he says the word hatred, any action done out of hatred has humongous negative karmic implication. So that's one point he's making. Then another point he's making is, right, that anger comes out of, and I said this last night, so I'll just say briefly, but anger begins with mental unhappiness, right? And then the whole time you're angry, you're agitated and unhappy, right? He makes this point, he says you can't eat well, you can't sleep, you can't rest, you can't enjoy, even if you, like, actually it's true, isn't it? Like, if you take somebody who's very angry someplace beautiful, it's not beautiful to them, right? And then also, like, if you go in a house, right? Like, actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, if you go in a house that has love in it, then however the house looks, externally, it feels wonderful, right? But then, if you've had that experience, like, you could be in like the nicest house or the nicest car or something, and if people are filled with hatred, it it feels horrible to be there, right? Like it feels like terrible, because that's what anger and hatred do. Right? And if people hate each other, actually, I often think that. Like I live in Northern Virginia, and there's this beautiful field. I sometimes go walk. Like there's a walking trail, and so a little bit of woods and a beautiful field, and it's very very peaceful, beautiful place with a stream running through it. But it's set aside because it was a place where in the Civil War, the Battle of Manassas took place there. And often I think of that, like if I walk there, I'll often stop and think, wow, like here I have this very peaceful feeling because I'm walking along and feeling love for the birds and all that. And then I think of all these, again, in that case, all these young men, right? Because of hatred, because of anger. It was a hell at one time. Like that place was experienced, for those people, it was experienced like a hell, right? And that's the effect of anger, isn't it? We can turn, it's just strange, isn't it? I mean, anger, we can turn our home into like a hell. If everybody's angry at each other, it feels like hell, actually, doesn't it? And you can turn a country, you can turn a neighborhood, you can turn, any place, right? All you have to do is if everybody there is angry at each other, it's like horrifying, right? If they hate each other, it's terrible. Terrible place to be, any place. And then he goes on to explain how also like if we get angry often, right, like it undermines our relationships and it destroys our relationships, doesn't it? And especially if we kind of dwell in anger and ruminate in anger, and that becomes like the main. If that starts to become a main way that people relate to each other, then their relationship is going to be horrible. And then also the main thing here, from a Buddhist perspective, one more point is, if you're trying to cultivate inner peace, right? Mental peace, and that's part of what he's getting about the points, is that, and that's why he said, how did he put it? He said, my mind will not experience peace. And he says, there is no evil like hatred and no fortitude like patience. Part of what he's getting at there too is if you start to introspect and watch your own mind, right? If you start to practice meditation, then you actually see very easily. Actually, people who don't say it right, if you're very externally focused, you may not notice it. But if you start to look at your own mind and watch, actually, like if you actually sit and watch your mind when you're angry, it's like an unbelievable teaching, actually, right? Like if you, so if you just sit down quietly and practice mindfulness, but not practice mindfulness of your breathing in that case, because that'll distract you. But just look at your mind. Does that make sense? And watch your mind. And like, it's actually like, what's the word? There's a saying in one of the Prajnaparamita, Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and it says it's like space tied up in knots. Whereas, because the mind itself is, if you look at what is mind, it's just open. Right? But then when you're angry, it's like it's all tied up, right? Like that. It's like this horrible feeling, and it's all tense and tight. That was the Buddha's description. He said it's like taking space and tying it up in knots. That's the feeling. There's no mental peace at all, right? And then that's what he's saying. So there's no fortitude like patience. What he's saying is if you're trying to cultivate mental peace, then you have to become patient. Right? And actually, there's no way to progress in meditation if your mind is agitated and filled with hatred or anger. Right? So he goes through a lot of detail about it. And part of that, the reason why he starts that way, Shantideva, is it's actually fun. Usually we were joking about this. I said something this briefly at lunch, but like usually when we're angry, we think, well, the other person should change. That's the main thought. Like, mostly that's our thought. Is like, well, if they would change, everything would be fine. And what Shantideva is saying is, you have to change yourself. Right? In other words, there are always going to be people in the world doing things you don't like. And actually, of course, they're right, because it's just what you like. Why in the world would everybody face? It's kind of funny, right? When we're angry, we think, well, they should just stop doing this. But of course, it's like ridiculous, actually, isn't it? Because of course, not everybody's going to do what I think is right. That's actually childish, isn't it? And so what Shantideva is saying here, in a sense, is we have to take responsibility for our own mind, right? And we have to learn how to control our own process of how we view situations and how we interact with situations in order to cultivate patience. And That's okay. So we go through a few. So one, they say in general, one antidote to anger. So one method of meditating on patience is what we just did. It's meditating on love. Because actually they say love and anger are two opposite mental states. So in other words, you can't be loving while you're angry. And it's interesting because oftentimes, like for example, like I guess it's how we use words or something. But it's like sometimes, like if you're like when you're angry at somebody, it's funny in English. We'll say this. We'll say, "I'm angry at somebody who I love." Right? That's very common, isn't it? Whether it's your partner or your child or your parent or somebody, you say, "I'm angry at this person who I love." Which is interesting because if you actually introspect, the truth is, of course, you don't love them in that moment. Whereas you saying, like you say, "This is somebody I love," and if you mean like in some generic way, they're a person who, in general, in life. But then you have to introspect, because actually, what do you mean by I love them? Actually, right? Because if you say, "I'm often angry at them, but I love them," like maybe, if you actually introspect and watch your own mind, like it's hard to say what you mean by, like you have to ask yourself, what do I mean by I love them? If I'm angry at them, then, because actually when you're angry at somebody, you kind of want to forcefully make them something else, right? Be different. And that's not love. That's the opposite of love, right? Love cherishes somebody as they are, right? Like love looks at somebody and wants them to be happy and wants them to have what they want. When you're angry at somebody, you want them to be how you want, right? So actually, they're opposite. So what you can say, there is a way you can say, "Oh, I usually love this person, but now I'm angry at them." That's true, that happens. But we have to admit, actually, when we're angry at them, we don't love them, actually. Not really. Like, in other words, in that moment, because anger is aggressive, right? And love supports the other and is gentle towards the other. Not that there aren't forms of love that are a little forceful, but it's not violent, right? Love is never violent. Whereas anger by its nature has a kind of aggressive, violent quality. So the point is if you meditate on love, then that's an antidote to anger. One challenge, though, is interesting, right? In one way that can work, like as almost like to inoculate yourself. So if you meditate on, like if in one way that can work. Like in other words, if okay, this is somebody I often get angry at, but I'm not angry at them right now, so I'm going to go meditate on love for them, then that will make it less likely for you, or harder for you to get angry at them. Does that make sense? Of course, if you're already angry at the person in the moment, then meditating on love for them is going to be what? If you sat down and tried to meditate on love, it's not going to really work, is it? You'll think, well, it'll be like phony or something, right? Like if you can sort of say, "Oh, yeah, maybe they'd be happy." Actually, I think it's funny with that person. But it is a good practice if you're not angry at them, right? Like, and also if you've been angry at somebody, right, and then okay, usually when I see them, I get mad again. Then that's great to meditate on love for them, right? So you start meditating on, like that was what we did in the practice, right? So you think about they want to be happy, they don't want to suffer, and we'll get into more about this. And then you start to meditate on love for that person. And if you do that enough, it'll decrease your tendency to get angry at them. Of course, once you're very angry, it's quite difficult in that moment to meditate on love for the person. But then I want to get into, so that's one method. But I want to actually bring up another method that Shantideva mentions and talk about it. Because it's interesting. I think it's a very interesting one psychologically to think about from Buddhist psychological teaching. So, let's see, yeah. Oh, here it is. I'm going to skip. Well, actually, okay, I'll read 3 verses. He says, I mentioned this. So, having found its fuel of mental unhappiness in the prevention of what I wish for and the doing of what I do not want, hatred increases and then destroys me. Right. So there he's saying, anger, hatred comes from being unhappy. Right? Then he says, therefore, I should totally eradicate the fuel of this enemy, unhappiness. Right? He says, for this enemy has no other function than to cause me more harm. He's saying, if you're already unhappy and then you get angry, then you're more unhappy. Right? So he says, so just don't be unhappy. Then he says, whatever befalls me, I shall not disturb my mental joy. For having been made unhappy, I shall not accomplish what I wish, and my virtues will decline. So in one way, this is kind of funny, right? Shantideva was saying, anger comes from mental unhappiness. He's saying, so just be happy. Then you won't have to get angry. Of course, that's a little funny in one way, right? Because you could say, well, yeah, but I'm not happy. Like when things happen that I don't like, I'm not happy. So what are you talking about, Shantideva, right? If you wanted to, you could debate with him or something. And part of this is interesting because what Shantideva is saying here is actually quite deep, and he gets into it in detail. Because what he's getting at is this, is when we're childish, in a way. And by childish, I mean a normal person. Buddhism calls normal people childish. Then they have Arya, noble beings are not childish. Noble beings are the ones who are not childish. So from a Buddhist perspective, we're childish means us. And what it's getting at here is this, is like, when we're childish, we think like we have some idea that things should go our way, that things should be how we want. And particularly, right, like the people, like our coworker should act toward, like Lama Zopa often says this, he'll use this example, it always makes me laugh. He says, like, your anger it just depends on somebody's facial expression. Like he's like, at work, if the person's like this, then you're happy. If they're like that, then you can actually become angry. Just their face changes. And that happens, doesn't it? Like, if somebody looks at you like a certain way, you can become, and if it's your like partner or somewhere, it'd be easy to get really angry. Like, why are you looking at me? What are you? Just as their face, right? That's all they did was change their face. And so, like, there's some part of us that, like, what Shantideva is getting at is quite deep here, right? So he's saying that, like, we think things should happen the way we want them to happen, but that's just how we want them to happen. It's totally ridiculous. And so what he's saying here is interesting. What he's getting at is, and this is like a big topic, but the idea is to, so Shantideva is not saying just be happy by saying, oh, I'll just be happy. He's also not saying just be happy by like not having anything you don't like happen to you, because that's not going to happen. And so what Shantideva is saying here is, like, I'll put it this way, like, we're in samsaric existence. And the Buddha said, that has a nature of suffering and difficulties. And it has a nature that people won't do what we like, And so what he's getting at is like a deep process of embracing life, actually, right? Of embracing whatever is and accepting whatever is in that moment, right? So he's not saying don't be unhappy in the sense like, what's there to say, right? If something, like if you're, like this, like, so, whether it's like with a coworker, right? Like you want to have some kind of good meeting with them, and then you go talk to them, and then they're annoying and obnoxious to you. Or you come home to your partner or your family member, somebody in your family, right? And they're in a bad mood, and they start to like do exactly the opposite of what you want. And they start to vent at you or something, right? Like ordinarily, we might get angry, right? What Shantideva is suggesting here is like that from a Buddhist perspective, Buddhist training, from any perspective, what Buddhism is suggesting is like to embrace that moment as precious. And actually, Buddhism would say, in some way, that's more precious than when things are going your way. That's strange. Like, it's funny, it just made me remember this. Like, Rebirth, one of my teachers, we were talking about it, but he used to say, he said, like, he liked it when he had grown up in a region called Kham in Tibet, and then he moved to central Tibet, and nobody knew him there. Like, and he said, oh, it was great. Nobody knew me. Like, so people didn't necessarily treat me very respectfully. He said, it was really nice. And he said, then I went back to Kham, where he was like this famous reincarnated Lama, and everybody was treating him with great respect. And he said, oh, that was terrible. Like there's this idea, right, that like, and part of the point is, like, what was he saying? He was saying, well, that would tend to sort of say, right, if you're in some place like that where everybody's treating you nice, there's more tendency to become arrogant and prideful. It was easier to be humble when he was someplace where nobody knew him. So he preferred that. It's an interesting point. So I want to go into this in detail, and this is like mind training now. So the point is this, and so how do you embrace difficulties? And so I want to go through like a list of ways of embracing. A list. Like Buddhism, it's funny because you would think, oh, but part of this is, I want to be very clear. Buddhism is not saying look for difficulties. Right? Actually, we don't have to look for them. They come along naturally. It's part of life. Right? And when good things are happening, great. What Buddhist teaching suggests is when good things are happening, enjoy them with love, right? And without grasping, because they won't last forever. When bad things are happening, enjoy them with love, because they won't last forever. You can enjoy both. But so how do you enjoy the bad? We know how to enjoy good things. And actually, sometimes we don't. We grasp at them and want them to be permanent, which then, of course, makes us unhappy. So with good times, the trick is not to grasp them as if they should be permanent, because they won't be. Right? Nothing's permanent, so good times won't be. But then the harder challenge here for anger is how do you embrace the bad times? And so I want to go through a list. So one I already said, so I'll start with that, right? Is when negative experiences happen or somebody puts us down or something like that, one is that's how, actually it's really true, is that's how we, when difficulties happen, that's how we develop humility, right? And it's actually true. One thing I'll say is, professionally as a psychologist, I sometimes like working with people who are narcissistic. And I often say, I always think the best thing that can happen for somebody who's narcissistic is huge loss and difficulties, because otherwise they'll never stop. But we're all like that. There is narcissists in the diagnostic sense. They need really bad, sometimes that's your fifth divorce. You finally got it. It's something like that, where the person can get, wow, it's me. I'm causing my suffering. But we all have our patterns like that. Does that make sense? I'm giving an example of somebody extreme, but we all have things that we do that cause us suffering, and we all have our patterns we're stuck in. And it's only when we meet up with the consequences of those sometimes that we recognize, so for example, somebody saying you're really annoying, right? And we get angry. But actually maybe they have a point. Maybe we are being annoying, right? That's humility, right? Somebody says you're so selfish, or you're so stupid, or you're so whatever, a coworker or a family member. Well, part of it is they know, if it's your family, they know you pretty well. Maybe they're partly right. That's humility, right? They're not always right, but sometimes. Another one is, it's through suffering, actually, oftentimes, that we develop empathy. And actually, I often think that when you see people who, oftentimes somebody who's been through a particular, say, disease, then they have they are helping other people who have that. Or somebody who's been through a certain experience, then they're helping other people who have that experience. Because it gets sometimes a deeper kind of empathy. And if you've been through a certain experience, actually, it's sometimes true, right? When you sit with somebody who's been through that, you can feel it more in your heart. And empathy is a good thing, right? And then also empathy leads to compassion, right? Empathy and compassion are slightly different, right? But actually, we learn compassion a lot, largely through our own experiences of suffering, right? And when we suffer with others, that's how we develop more compassion. And if we recognize when we're suffering, oh, I'm like everybody else. It's common humanity, right? Not just humanity, animals too, but so it's actually in our suffering that when we recognize a mistake sometimes we make when we're suffering is to think, oh, it's only me, right? But if you recognize everybody's suffering, right, and we're all the same in that way, then our suffering actually our suffering is our teacher of compassion in many ways, right? And compassion is, as I say, the most exalted state of the heart, right? So it's suffering that teaches us compassion, right? And the suffering is in some ways the most important teacher, right? Like a spiritual teacher can lecture about, right? Like someone like Lama Zopa can lecture about compassion, but then it's actually your own experience of difficulties that change, that deepen your actual experience of compassion. Then also, the Buddha, right, said, the spiritual path begins with the recognition of your own suffering. Right? The first noble truth was the truth of suffering. Right? And so the Buddha, and actually, if you look at I'll make this point actually. The Buddha said that himself, right? And then in the Buddha's own life, right? He was, the story, right? He was this prince, right? And his father protected him from anything difficult, right? And then he saw 4 sights, right? Somebody who was sick, somebody who was very elderly, somebody who had a corpse of somebody who had died, and then he saw a spiritual practitioner, like a yogi, or something. And that was the beginning. So it was his encounter with suffering, and in a way, that story symbolizes everybody's process. And actually, it's true, isn't it? Like, I've often thought this over the years. If you look at yourself or at the people you know most deeply, right, and you ask, what really deeply began their spiritual journey, and when did they grow the most in their spiritual journey? It's actually sometimes it's disappointing. I always wish it could be like, oh, it was just fun. Everything was fine, But if you really ask deeply, and actually, if you don't know the person well, then maybe it's not. You don't know that. But once you get to know somebody deeply and sincerely, and you ask them, well, if somebody who's made some kind of inner growth and spiritual progress and real development, almost always, right? It began with some kind of experience of them recognizing, usually their own suffering, actually, or people close to them. And then when they made the most progress, it was that. Just thought it popped in my head, so I'll just share a very brief story. Actually, of my closest friend. One day, I was talking to him. Actually, he was doing his in Tibetan Buddhism. Sometimes there are these Namdrol, where you do 100,000 of this, you do a lot of practices, and he had just finished 100,000 Vajrasattva mantras. So it took a long time, put a lot of effort. And then he's very honest with me, so he called me up, and we often talk, and he said to me, well, all right, I did my 100,000 thing and all that. And he said, I don't think this did anything for me. What's the point? So I'm saying some mantra and I'm visualizing. He said, who cares? And I said, and we were talking. He was being very honest. And I said, well, actually, I've known you obviously all this time, and you have made progress. And then he said, yeah, but is that why? Is it because I did some mantras? And I thought about it. And he has a number of health. He has very severe arthritis that causes him severe pain every day, and he also has a gastrointestinal problem that causes him a lot of pain. And we were talking, and I said, well, I don't know if it was the Vajrasattva or if it was that you were in pain, because you've become more humble, you've become more compassionate, you've become more kind. And finally what we came to is it was because you were doing the mantras while you were in pain. And that pain was teaching you something about others' pain. And then he was kinder to his wife when she was in pain, and he was kinder to other people. And we said, yeah, if you hadn't been in pain and you've just done them, maybe it wouldn't have grown. I don't know. But it did, because you were in pain while you were doing those. And so while he was in pain, he was thinking about Vajrasattva, and he was thinking of sharing that purification with others, and he was thinking about the people he cares about, and then strangers, and then, and I was like, wow, it was the pain was partly what made him actually progress. And I've known other people who did 100,000. I thought, well, I'm not sure they progressed at all, So it was interesting, right? And the point is it's I sometimes think, again, I always think, well, it'd be nice if there were sometimes stories where it wasn't that, where there was no difficulty or something. But it doesn't seem like that's how it is, and that's even what Buddhism actually asserts, right? The Buddhist own story, teaching of the Four Noble Truths. So it's because, there is introspection, and change is hard, right? Really changing yourself deeply is hard work. And so if everything's just I don't know, if you're so distracted and something's not bothering you, why do that, right? And I think actually, if people aren't facing what's difficult, oftentimes we can go through. I've had periods like that, I think, actually, where I think sometimes I looked and I thought, oh wow, I was just I like practicing Dharma, so I was doing it, but I thought, there's sometimes some periods in my life where I look back and I think, I don't think I made much progress in that time, because I was just I wasn't really facing something, or I wasn't really being honest, or I wasn't. And then you need something that wakes you up, and then you maybe take another step. That's a real step. Okay, so that's another one, right? Is that sometimes in formal you could say it's renunciation, right? It's but it's the energy in a way, right, that makes a person want to change. And then not just compassion, but actually bodhicitta, that comes from the recognition of suffering, of our own and then others. So bodhicitta grows out of our awareness of suffering. Then also there are so many benefits of suffering. It's funny. Then another point they say in Buddhism is, in the Buddhist teachings, is actually I'll make this one also first, because it's similar to what I was just saying. also, like, in terms of your own spiritual practice, right, your own inner practice, your own Dharma practice, whatever you want to call it, I think actually when things are going well, you can't really say for sure if you're making progress. Like you might hope you're making progress, but you actually only know when something goes wrong, isn't it? Like that. Whereas, like, if you're if something went wrong and you started practicing, and then you're practicing some practice, right, like some kind of meditation practice or something, it may be pleasurable to do, or maybe interesting and enjoyable to do. But in a way, it's only when like if you're trying to, and actually, yeah, so mainly it's when something difficult happens, then you know, oh wow, I'm making some progress. And there's that famous, I don't know if you guys have heard this, there's a famous story about Atisha. There's a great Indian master. And I always think it's funny. He had this he came from India to Tibet, and he had this extremely annoying Indian assistant who was always with him. And the guy would get on everybody's nerves because he was always annoying. And Atisha insisted the guy stay with him. Like, the guy kept wanting to go back to India, and Atisha said, no, please stay, please stay. And so the guy kept staying, and of course all the Tibetans were like, oh, this guy. And finally, Atisha said to the guy, okay, you can go back to India now. And the guy was happy to leave. And then the Tibetan said, why did you keep him for so long, and why did you finally send him back? And he said, I kept him because I needed somebody to check, I needed somebody in my life where I could practice and check my patience level. And then they said, well, why'd you send him back? And he said, well, I got to know you Tibetans better. I realized I didn't need somebody else. And, at the time, he said, some of you were quite annoying also, so it's okay. I don't need him now. He was sort of teasing them, I think. But anyway, the point is that's what Atisha was saying was that's the test, right? The test is the difficult person. Can you practice love for them? Because actually, if you're loving somebody who's going to be very nice to you, if you're loving to them, well, then are you really loving them because you love them, or are you loving them because you're going to get praise or good treatment back? But if you can love somebody who's going to be unpleasant regardless, then you know, oh, wow, I'm really loving them. Another point, there are all these benefits. Then also, this is in the teachings, Gyumen Khenso, he said that he was making this point. It's in the teachings, but I hadn't heard it before. He was saying also, actually it goes back to the story of the Buddha's enlightenment, but they say, when you try, if you want to subdue or benefit or change other people, when you try to do it through anger, it never works, right? Whereas if you're angry, and it's just true, right? Try, if you have somebody close to you in your life, try going to them and angrily telling them how they should should make some changes, and actually you'll have a 0% success rate. They'll never change. Whereas if you're loving, and actually, so what he was saying was, he said it's through love that we help others become better. It's when we're loving them, they naturally become better. And then he said, even if you want to subdue somebody, if you try to subdue them through anger, you can temporarily maybe get them to stop doing something, but then eventually they're going to come back and be angry at you and then try to get you. And then he was saying, whereas love is the real way to subdue. And actually there's that story in the Buddha's enlightenment, right? That story, the night he was meditating under the Bodhi tree, and they say the Mara, the demon the demon king, I guess, sent the army, right, of demons against him. And they say the Buddha entered, they call it the meditation on love, the samadhi, the concentration of love, of loving kindness. And they say that right then, as the demons were shooting arrows or missiles or whatever, they would become flowers and fall on his feet. Actually, I love this story. That story, I just think it's very touching, right? So he meditated on love for the demons, actually, right? And the demons couldn't harm when they gave up. Right? And then Mara himself, the head of the demons, was there. And actually, it's very touching. The Buddha, right? That's what if you see a Buddha statue, right, like that, or painting, he's touching the earth always, right, like this. And actually, I think it's very beautiful. The story is, at that point, it was the morning, right before dawn of his enlightenment, he touched the earth, and he called forth Mother Earth. Actually, that's really what it is. He touched the earth, like calling Mother Earth. And Mother Earth said, "I'm the witness to his love." Because the Mara was saying, "You don't deserve enlightenment. Nobody deserves to be enlightened." And it was actually very touching, isn't it, that he touched Mother Earth, and Mother Earth herself came and said, "I'm the witness. I've seen for lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, he practiced love." And he practiced love for his enemies. He practiced love for strangers. He practiced love for everybody. He gave of himself over and over again. And it's due to that force of love he deserves to be enlightened. And of course, Mara, the demon king, at that point gave up. Their Mother Earth herself kind of sort of testified, you could say, for the Buddha's love. And so it was through the force of his love that he kind of conquered. And that symbolizes that, right? As they say, and there was the point being, if he had fought with anger against them, and it would have been an endless battle. But because he met them with love, the battle ended. Right? It's an archetypal image of what we're talking about. Then other ones, right? Actually, this is another one that Shantideva goes into huge detail about. He says, this is the teaching on karma, right? Buddhist teaching on karma, is what's the source of our negative experiences? It's our own karma, right? And the teaching on karma says, there's a teaching, one part of it says karma is definite. So that means from virtuous actions or positive actions, only happiness comes. From negative actions, suffering comes. And it's never reversed. So an action of love doesn't create a karma of misery. An action of hatred doesn't create a karma of happiness. So the point being, there are many then points from that. But one is, so whatever bad experience we're having, one way of thinking about it is you can say, well, this is purifying my karma. Good. Better to be done with it now. Otherwise, it'll come later. That's one benefit. Another benefit of a bad experience, in a sense, is it's a teaching. Or is it saying, actually, sometimes they say, if you want to know what you were like in your past, I always think this is funny, sometimes in some people go to a psychic and they say, oh, you were some famous person in the past life. I don't know. But according to Buddhism, if it's karma is definite, right? So they would say, if you want to know who you were in a past life, look at the experiences of happiness and suffering you have. And whatever suffering experiences you had, you must have done that in some past life. And actually, one thing is that's not judgmental. The point is we've been alive, we've been existing, not alive, but we've been reincarnating and infinitely. So we've done everything. And we've been everything. We've been, every kind of life form. And so anyway, what this is saying though is, it's saying don't do that. One way of saying it is if somebody's doing something causing suffering to me, don't do it to somebody else. Is a teaching on karma, actually. Another point that Shantideva says, which I think is he has a sense of humor sometimes, I think, about this, because sometimes he says somebody else is being childish or bad, they're overcome with mental afflictions, and they're doing something bad to you. And then if you become angry and act back, well, then you're the same as them. There's no difference. So he says, so how is that a good idea? That's another way of thinking about it. And then Shantideva goes to this point actually about karma. That's intriguing in a way. What he's saying about this purification thing, Shantideva makes this point. He says, okay, so somebody's angry at you and they're doing something unpleasant. And then what he says is, so then I'm purifying my karma in that moment, right? If you think of karma in that way, it means I'm purifying. This person's creating a cause for their future suffering. So they're being harmed. And that was actually, I mentioned last night the story of Rima Rinpoche when he was tortured. That was the way he thought, actually. He said, I'm purifying whatever karma is left. He was there. He said, these people, the torturers, are creating causes for unbelievable suffering in the future. So he felt particular compassion for his own torturers, actually. So he said. Anyway, so the idea there is that suffering is a teaching on karma. And it's a teaching to do positive actions and not negative actions. So anyway, if I can go on. But the idea behind all these points, right, so the idea of it increases your empathy, it increases your humility, it increases your renunciation, it's a time of spiritual growth, is the idea there is ordinarily, right, part of why we become angry, as Shantideva said, is because we become mentally unhappy. So now he's getting at something subtle, I think, and we have to understand what he's getting at. When something negative happens to you, in one way, of course, you feel aversion, right? And it's very subtle in Buddhist psychology. So let's say you're going along, I go back to my example earlier, you're going along and then suddenly somebody says something very unpleasant to you, really mean, right? so that what they said, first of all, is an external stimulus, right? Now your ears hear that. Okay, you can't control that. Then you experience a displeasurable feeling. That displeasurable feeling is a result of past karma. That's what Buddhism is saying. And that you can't do anything about in that moment. Like the actual displeasure, when you hear the words and you feel displeasure, you can't do anything about that. But then you have a choice. And this is actually, Buddhism is saying this, and Western psychology actually says the same thing. Right? So at that moment, any bad thing happens to you, right? So the bad thing happens, you can't control the external. The feeling of displeasure, it may be a little displeasure, or maybe a very strong feeling of displeasure. That you can't control because that's not your current control, right? That just arises. That you can't stop. You can't stop that from happening. But then you have a choice at that moment. And that's what Shantideva is getting at when he's talking about, I'll keep my mind happy, right? So what he's saying is at that moment, it's up to your interpretation. And it's how you train yourself to interpret. So if you were raised, because of your past karmic life, or because of some combination, right? Our past karma, and our culture, and our family, and our whatever, but so we have certain thoughts at that moment. Does that make sense? And oftentimes we're not aware of those thoughts. There are thoughts that are actually there in our mind, but if we don't slow down enough, we're not aware we have them. But there are thoughts like, it shouldn't be this way. This person is terrible. They're horrible to do that. How could they possibly say that to me? And then we have thoughts, nobody should treat me that way. Or whatever, all kinds of different versions of it, right? And part of what Shantideva is getting at is that's where we can train ourselves. Because those thoughts are what cause us then to get angry. Whereas the person doing the action and our displeasure don't directly cause unhappiness. There's another factor, which is our interpretation of the events. Right? And so we can change our interpretation of the events. And so you can think, like, I'll use the example of Atisha, right? What I was getting earlier. When Atisha's assistant, or whatever that guy was, his assistant, I guess, would say something unpleasant to him, right? Like, Atisha's thought was like, must have been, he didn't say it, but it must have been some version of, like, oh, good. Here's my chance. I want to practice love for somebody who's difficult. Here's my chance. This is great. I hope he keeps up the difficult for a little while here so I can keep practicing being loving to somebody difficult. Right? So he wasn't getting angry because that was his interpretation of that. Oh, this is wonderful. And that's where I'm going to jump over to the 8 verses of mind training now. This is a famous, just a very short Buddhist text, just 8 stanzas. Here it is, this is 4 of the 8 verses. It says, when seeing a being of wicked nature, who is forced by violent wrongs and sufferings, I shall hold this one so hard to find, as though discovering a precious treasure. Right? So that's what he's getting at, right? He's saying, when I come across somebody who, and it's actually interesting how he says it, right? They're controlled. Actually, and it's the same thing Shantideva is saying. Here is actually this is another method. So one method was all those, like, seeing the advantages of suffering, right? Now it's getting into a slightly different method here, which is a couple points. I mean, they're related, but it adds a new thing here. It's recognizing, one point that's there is it's recognizing this other person who's appearing this way to me, right? They're appearing, and actually remember last night, for those who were here, I said, if the Dalai Lama often says, if there were one slogan of Buddhism, it's dependent origination, right? Interdependence. And so, again, like, our problem is we see things as concrete and almost like self-arisen. So somebody's, and actually it's almost bizarre, right? Like, I'll go back to the example from earlier. Like, so somebody who you say, I love them, right? I love this person, but now I'm angry at them because they came and they did something I don't like. So now I'm really mad at them, right? And you really feel mad, right? And in that moment, it appears like they're just, why are they like that? Right? You can even think that, why is this person like that? Don't they know they should treat me with so well? And what this is getting at is they're under the control of something, right? In other words, actually, they're not being angry or difficult for no reason, right? And oftentimes they're under the control of their own mental afflictions, right? When people are being difficult to us, usually that's the case. They're under the control. And so if they're under the control of their mental afflictions, where did those come from? Well, actually, they didn't intentionally go, let me have mental afflictions, right? Their mental afflictions come from, first of all, their own past lives. Second of all, everything that's ever happened to them in their life, right? Everything that built up to this moment helped make them who they are, and they can't help it at that point, right? And so it's like they have no control over themselves in that moment, right? Actually, when somebody's really being very difficult, they have no control. Actually, it's almost like they're insane, actually, right? Which we are too, or we look at it that way. And so what this is saying is, they can't help being insane, but you can, because you can teach yourself, right? And so here it's saying a couple things. One is, so you recognize, this person's acting this way due to all kinds of causes and conditions. Some of those causes and conditions are me, actually. I contribute to it. Other causes and conditions have nothing to do with me, but also have to do with them. It's all kinds of things that have led up to this moment, and cooperative conditions and all kinds of things, right? So one point is, anger is seeing them as kind of intrinsically that, right? They're bad. But in this, you say, well, no, they're not. They're just under the control of, and Shantideva uses a very famous example of that. He says, in Buddhist teachings, it's a famous example, where he says, if somebody were to hit you with a stick, why don't you get angry at the stick? He said, and then actually it goes through. So somebody hits you with a stick, you say, well, because they were holding the stick, and then you say, oh, so you're angry at their hand? Their hand was holding the stick. Well, no, I'm not angry at their hand. I'm angry at them, the person, right? And then he says, well, but the stick was controlled by the hand was controlled by the arm. The arm was controlled by their mind, but their mind was controlled by mental afflictions. So get angry at the mental afflictions then. And actually, the mental afflictions came from ignorance. So ultimately, you should get angry at ignorance. And then Shantideva says, and if you want to get angry at ignorance, that's okay. But to get angry at anything but the prime cause of the bad action is foolish, isn't it? And so it's saying, don't get angry. So that's a famous saying, and sometimes they'll say, don't get angry at the stick. And it's a metaphor, right? So don't get angry at the person either, right? Get angry at the root cause, which is the mental affliction. And then if you want to get angry at the mental affliction, what do you have to do? Well, first of all, you have to overcome your own mental afflictions, right? Which means stop being angry. Then, and only then, you can help somebody else maybe be less angry, right? You're not going to help them be less angry if you're angry, right? You're going to make them more angry, and it's going to become like that, right? But so then, okay, then why, but in this verse, right? So then why is, as though I've discovered a precious treasure. Why are they a precious treasure, right? Well, for all the reasons we just talked about, right? In other words, if your goal in life, and actually this is where it becomes really interesting, right? Because it's well, if my goal in life is that everything should be the way I want, always, then they're not a precious treasure. Right? Then they're just an annoyance. But if my goal in life is to be loving, if my goal in life, then they're a precious treasure because they're the one to be loved. Right? If my goal in life is my own spiritual progress, to progress and become more enlightened, then they're a precious treasure because they're the one who's helping me do that. Right? How else do I learn about compassion? How else do I learn about empathy? How else do I learn about love? How else do I learn about patience? They're my teacher of that. Right? And I won't learn that without them. So then you actually come to the point where you realize, well, I'm their annoyance and they're my teacher. It's I'm annoying them now, but they're teaching me. So then you can actually imagine, at first it seems far-fetched, I think, when you read a verse like a precious treasure, right? But if you think deeply about it, there comes a point where you can actually see how you could feel that, right? That when somebody's difficult, it's like they're a precious treasure. And then there's another point I'll make too, which is, for those who are Buddhist, right? It's quite interesting. I'll share this. Gyume Kensho Rinpoche, one of my teachers, often says this point. He says, like we did, like here, you guys have beauty. It's nice. Like you said, oh, we have the incense and rice and lights and water bowls. So all kinds of offerings to the Buddha. And so, like, people make various kinds of offerings to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And then, what Ken Rinpoche often points out is he says, the best offering to the Buddha is to be loving to a difficult person. That's the offering the Buddha is most pleasing to the Buddha. This is like, because actually, like, when you make offerings like lights, let's say, or incense, the only reason the Buddha is at all pleased with that is that it's benefiting you, actually, right? If the Buddha is pleased by that because the Buddha has compassion for you, and you being if you practice generosity, it's good karma for you. So in that sense, the Buddha could be pleased that but actually a Buddha statue or Buddha image doesn't need incense or water, like, obviously. So if the Buddha is watching, right, the Buddha would say, well, okay, they're like, actually, at least they're benefiting themselves. That's something good. Okay, fine. But mainly, what's a Buddha, right? Mainly the Buddha exists out of love and compassion for all sentient beings, right? So that means the person who's annoying you or angry at you or treating you badly, the Buddha's very nature and very purpose of existence is to love them and to help them become enlightened, right? And in that moment, like, the Buddha can't manifest to them because they don't have that interest or that mindset or that karma or something. But what can benefit them at that time? Mainly it's you being loving to them, right? Mainly it's you being patient to them. And so actually, like, it's an interesting point, like, just kind of, I think it's quite beautiful in a way, is like the best offering you can make to the Buddha is to be loving to the person who's difficult to you. And that you can almost imagine, like I can imagine, like, the Buddha of compassion, like, weeping with joy that you're doing that, right? Because it's like, that's their child. It'd be like that, right? It's like if a parent absolutely adored their child and their child were acting bad in the playground, and some other kid were nice to them and tried to teach them, like, the parent would be so happy, right? Wouldn't it? It's like your child made a mistake and then the other kid were correcting that and helping them instead of just punching them or something. The parent would be so pleased, like, oh, wow, like their heart would be. That's how the Buddha would see you when you do that. When somebody's being annoying to you and then you be nice to them and help them, it's like the Buddha is so happy, like that. Does that make sense? And there's no better. There's like nothing better because the Buddha's main point is helping people, right? And that's you're actually helping somebody. Actually, I'll continue. Maybe I'll go like I'll just keep going with this one. I'm going to read verse 5, the verse that comes right after that, because it's on the same theme. So, and then it says, when others out of jealousy treat me badly with abuse, insults, and the like, I shall accept their harsh words and offer the victory to others. And this one I think is a subtle point in a way, because I actually want to go back in a way. I want to connect this to that earlier point where Shanti Deva was saying, keep your mind happy, right? Even when something difficult happens. Now we're talking about anger, though. So I want to raise an issue related to these verses to think about together. And it's this. So let's say, there are different situations. One situation, like, you're preventing the anger, right? But then there's another situation where something happens and you just get angry, right? You're like, so you didn't watch your interpretation, or you weren't trained well enough yet, right? So you interpret it in some negative way and then you get angry. Right? So then I think there's a point that connects to all of this, which is, so then what do you do? Right? Now you're angry, right? Like, so what do you do? And I want to make some suggestions. The first thing is, I think, first step is we have to, if we're going to actually practice anything, we have to admit to ourselves, I'm angry. Right? Whereas if you don't know you're angry, you can't work with the anger, right? So I think the first step is you have to know, because, and actually, people do that, right? Have you ever had that experience? Like, why are you so angry? I'm not angry. Don't say I'm angry. Why are you saying? We can be like that, right? So the first step is you have to know you're angry, or else you can't do anything with it. And then, of course, then I guess there are a lot of options, right? You have many, many options. And that's part of what I was getting at earlier about this idea that we need many options, right? And so, for yourself, right, you can think, from the points we made already, for your own benefit, you can think, okay, well, good, this is my chance to practice, right? That's the habit you want to develop, right? Is as soon as you recognize I'm angry, you want to say, okay, here's my chance to really practice transformation, to really practice mental training, to really practice spiritual path. So as soon as you recognize you're angry, the idea is you think, oh, good, okay, I'm gonna try. Like, this is my real opportunity, right? Like the precious treasure, if you like. And then you could have all these different things, right? You think, okay, I'm purifying my karma. Okay, they're controlled by. Actually, it's quite interesting. If you start to think they're controlled by other factors, I'm interpreting as if they're doing this, like, what's the word? As if this is like intrinsically who they are in this moment. But it's not intrinsically who they are. They're controlled. Anybody is controlled, right? And actually, we know that, right? Like, there was this ridiculous, isn't it? It's just so strange, I think. Like, when you look at life, right? At your own life, like, nobody's intrinsically anything, right? Like, and the deepest enemies become, you probably had that experience in your life, right? Where, like, I don't think that, like, you can see where people were so, what's the word? If you think of, like, people who if you see pictures of somebody's wedding day, and then if somebody had a bad divorce and you see them at the time, then you can see, like, wow, like, and their wedding day is like, oh, they said all these poems and things about them. And then, like, if a bad divorce, they, like, like, even the very sight of them, it's like they hate even the name of that person or something, right? Like, and then sometimes they remarry. The point is like, everything is like that, right? Even nations, right? Like, nations go to, like nations hate each other, and they go to, like, they create, what's that called? Propaganda, right? They say, oh, these people are terrible, and they're like, and then they always make up, like, what's the word? Where they're all bad. They tell, like, some propaganda that the other side is all bad, right? And it's so strange, because then those same nations are allies later, right? And then they hate somebody else together, and they want to kill the other. Like, if you look at history, that's the whole history of humanity. It's been that, right? We're like, and it's so, that's why the Buddhas, when they look at ordinary people, say they're childish. Actually, isn't it? If you look at us, I don't mean us personally, but us, like us, normal people, like, we're insane, childish beings who do such stupid things. Like, we take a beautiful field and we turn it into a battleground, right? Like, which we don't have to do. Anyway, so the point is that when you're angry, you recognize, oh, that's, like, this is my chance to stop being that. The Dalai Lama often says this. He says, that's your contribution to world peace, right? And if you can, and actually it's really touching, I think, if you think about it. It's like, well, if I can't be patient, whereas if my spouse or my child did something annoying, and I can't be patient with them, then for me to go around saying there should be world peace is, like, total hypocrisy and ridiculous, isn't it? Like, in other words, if I can't be patient with that person, then how can I say, oh, the nation should be able to do it? I have all these teachings, right? Like, we could each say that. I can read these books. I can understand these ideas. I can study these things. I can think about it. And other people don't have that access. There are many people who don't, right? So if I have all that and I'm not going to practice, then who's going to practice? And that's why Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he often says this point. He says, if somebody were asked the question, where does peace start? The answer is always me. Right? You can't say the answer is somebody else. Actually, then you're being, like, actually that's the cause of war, in a way. If you say peace should start with somebody else, then you're contributing to that, right? So what he's saying is peace always starts with me. But then, then when you're also in that state of anger, you just have to do something to stop and ask yourself. And this gets to what I was saying earlier about boundaries. Yesterday I said something about boundaries. There is a point now also where you have to ask yourself, and I think the right way to ask it is oftentimes when you're angry, if you're honest with yourself and you ask yourself, okay, this anger came from something. right? Just like the other person is controlled by, in other words, I'm controlled now by this feeling, but I'm not going to stay in it. This first thing, right? You're committing to that. You're going to practice. But then I think you have to ask yourself sometimes a point, which I think is implied in what Shantideva is saying. And also, I was saying this a little bit. If I watch like the monks and the lamas I know, they take responsibility for this, and we need to do that too. And what I mean is to recognize it doesn't, with this point about give the victory to the other, that doesn't mean be a doormat necessarily. That doesn't mean play the role of the victim or something. Because oftentimes, actually, when you're angry, what it means, actually, if you're honest with yourself, what it often means is, I didn't set a boundary 4 steps ago, and I was already getting frustrated. I was already getting impatient. And I kept going and going, not taking responsibility to set a boundary and say, I need to step away, or I need to, that I didn't take the responsibility to set a boundary before it got to this point. And now I'm angry, and it's actually partly, again, my responsibility. So now I need to set that boundary in order to calm down and stop being angry. And actually, maybe I'll share one very brief personal story that was funny for me about this one. One time I was sitting in at the time, Gyume Kensei Rinpoche and his assistant, Geshe Tashi, were sitting in the living room. They were living with me at the time, and they were all sitting around. And for a few weeks, there was a guy who had been sending me these like very angry emails, like where he was like insulting. He was insulting the lamas, insulting Dalai Lama. He was like just kind of, he was under the control of his mental afflictions. And I thought, I'll try to help him. So I would write to him and say, you should think this way. And then he would write back and get more angry. He's like, he would insult me. Then I was like kind of getting a little annoyed, I'm just trying to help you. Why are you being like that? And then like I would say something nice again. And then again he would say, and I was getting, and then I'm sitting next to Geshe Tashi, and I'm sitting right next to him on the couch, and it's like, bloop, like whatever the sound. And I look over, and he just got an email from this guy. And I'm looking like, I recognize the email address because I've been emailing with the guy. And he immediately just like clicks on, he doesn't even open, that you can click and then delete. And he just deleted it. And I said, why'd you delete it? What's he writing to you about? He said, I don't know. And I said, what do you mean you don't know? Like, has he been writing to you regularly? He said, I don't know, I don't read his email. and I said, he's like a geshe, right? And I said, well, why don't you read his emails? And he said, I don't know, somebody could get angry if I read his emails. Him or me, I don't know. Like, why would I read them? And I was like, that's a boundary, right? Like, and I was like, he's a lot smarter than me. So I've been sending emailing back and forth, and I'm getting, I was sort of certainly annoyed by a certain point. I'm like, he's still saying these stupid things, and I'm trying to be nice to him. And I was like, wow, I could just like block him. I was like, what a good idea. And I was like, and I was never angry again about that, or never even upset again. The point being, like, that's a boundary, right? Like, so my dear friend Geshe Tashi didn't get angry. Right? Why didn't he get angry? Because he didn't, because he had set a boundary beforehand, right? And part of what he was recognizing is, I assume he was recognizing about himself. Well, if I go too far down that road, I'm going to start to get annoyed. Why in the world would I do that?
So I have a question, and it's interesting that you are there, because that was going to be kind of my question, thinking about the boundaries that you were kind of walking us through yesterday, because there's this point many times in your life where you have to kind of, to your point, you love the person that is bringing difficulty to your life, but then when is the point where you say, I'd rather walk away than trying to keep, being compassionate and loving to someone who, whose difficulty brought into my existence are kind of harming me. So then you choose to kind of to stay there and to try to learn and to practice the Dharma, to your point, but how do you identify when to say, it's time to walk away? You know what I mean?
And you mean like totally walk away? Like not, because sometimes it can be walk away temporary. Like sometimes it means I need to walk away for a half hour or an hour or 2 hours. Yeah. And then other times where I have to walk away forever. Yeah. But, or for that whole life, let's say. Do you mean both, or do you mean the short term walk away, or maybe permanent?
Both.
Whatever works.
Yes, exactly.
Well, so actually I'll answer both questions, because I think the answer is different, of course.
Yes.
But I'll start with one point. The first point I want to say is I really think this is a good question and important, right? And I think one thing that's so important in this is to be honest with ourselves, right? About our own level and our own, where we're at in any given time. Because it's easy, I think, especially like people who want to be kind, and compassionate, I think it's easy to, like, in a way, deceive ourselves. Like thinking I'm more able to be compassionate than I am to somebody, and thinking I can have more influence than I can or something. So one point is I think we have to be honest and realistic to ourselves. And then I'll say a couple other thoughts. Like one thing about the short term first, I'll say the short term walk away. I actually learned something about that personally from there's a wonderful researcher, psychologist, researcher called, who some of you may have heard, John Gottman. He's like the best researcher on couples in the world. I think. He did a lot of good scientific research on marriage. And I thought he was like the best scientific researcher. He could actually predict divorce. He could watch a couple have an argument and he could predict if they would stay married or divorced very accurately. Like it was over 90% something accurate. But anyway, he in one of his books, he based on his research, he says, if you're flooded with emotion, and he's using the example of marriage, but you could apply it to other things too. He basically said, if you're flooded with emotion, it's never useful to continue speaking. Or it's always better to walk away for at least a half hour. And I thought, never? Wow. And I was like, yeah, he's, that was, and he was saying that based on actual scientific research. So one point is, it's like, if either person is actually flooded, it's better to walk away, really. And the one exception, if both people are flooded, it's always better to walk away. If one person is flooded, it's useless to talk about the topic. If that person can accept kindness to soothe them, that can be useful. But talking about the topic is never useful at that point, because people's brains also don't process information. So, actually we don't process new information well at all. So it's interesting. So one point is, in terms of walking away, is if both people are flooded, as soon as you're flooded, actually one point is this, as soon as you're flooded, it's always the right thing to walk away. And so if your emotions are starting to flood it up and become intense in a way, like flooding of emotions, then it's always better to walk away. If the other person's emotions are flooded, and then if you have to be honest with yourself. If you say to yourself, I'm going to get flooded too, and we can know that if we're honest, then we say, I need to take a break, I'll come back, and then you have to walk away. If you can know, there are times where the other person can be flooded and you can know, oh, I'm just in a state of love and I don't care. I don't care if they're upset. I just love them and I'll calm them down. I won't talk about the topic because that's useless. But I can be kind to them and try to help them feel better. Then that can be okay. But so the one rule is, in the short term, if you're flooded with emotion or you're close to getting flooded with emotion, it's always better to walk away. That's interesting, isn't it? And then the longer term one, one Buddhist point on that one is, it's an interesting thing, like, the Buddhist view would be like, on the one hand, if we're trying to practice the Bodhisattva's way of life, we say that there's often this idea, in your heart, you still hold the person in compassion. In other words, so you don't want to close. The one point is, and actually, it's really true. Actually, though, in other words, there's a difference between choosing to walk away and closing your heart to somebody. So in other words, we can keep our heart open with compassion and love for somebody, but really, again, it's a question of honest with ourselves, and not overestimating our ability to have an influence. And oftentimes, I think, the truth. Actually, I'll just be honest. I think really the truth is, if you've tried numerous times, right, in a relationship to help somebody, and you don't see them in a sincere, genuine way changing or trying to change, or trying in a genuine way to change, then to ask yourself, well, then why am I staying actually in that relationship? There's usually some other reason. Like I want to convince myself that I'm this nice person, or I want to convince them I'm a nice person, or my parents told me I'm supposed to be a certain way, and a certain whatever. Like we have some, or my culture told me, or sometimes it's people who are a good person, or people who are this kind of person. But usually it's like, and I guess, so further I say something about that, also self-constraint, like, And for me personally, also, it helped me from a Buddhist perspective, watching. I remember this once, like, I've had many examples like this. I told a story about Geshe Tashi, but like, I'll tell one story about Lama Zopa Rinpoche, which always makes me kind of laugh. But I was sitting there with Lama Zopa Rinpoche once at lunch. He had come to Guhyasamaja Center, where in Washington area, and I cooked lunch. I was so happy to get to cook lunch for him. And then this guy came and like started like talking about some financial ideas he had or something. And my immediate reaction was like, on the one hand, I thought, well, he seemed like I assumed he was talking about the Lama Zopa, maybe he wanted to donate or something. So I thought, okay, good. This is kind of boring to me, but good. And Lama Zopa is well known not to sleep. He doesn't sleep. Like he only sleeps maybe like 2 hours a day or something, 1 hour. Sometimes he doesn't sleep for 3 or 4 days. So he doesn't really sleep. And suddenly I'm like looking at the guy, listening to him talk, and I hear, and I look, and Lama Zopa was like this, and then he goes, oh. I guess he had just, and then he said, I have to go upstairs, and he left, and he immediately left the room, and the guy was like, oh, okay, and then he looks at me and starts telling me things going on to me about it, which I had known, and I was like, wow, like Lama Zopa had no hesitation. I have to leave. And then I was like, the same thing happened one day. I was with my other teacher, Gyumei Khyentse Rinpoche, and I and another friend were there, and we had asked some teaching. He was giving us like a private teaching, a personal teaching of some topic we wanted. And I loved it. It was like, wow, we're studying with him. He was teaching. So we finished, and he finished teaching the part of the text he was going to teach that day, and we had some questions. We were asking him some questions about the text, and he was answering those questions. And then, like, as normal happens, right? We finished asking our questions, and then the conversation drifted to like a normal conversation. And we were just talking about like work or something. And I was like, I suddenly, like, I guess my friend said something, and I turned to him, and suddenly I felt something like brush against my skin. It was his robes. And he was like up the stairs, and he was like gone. And I was like, whoa, where'd he go? And I was like, he doesn't want to talk about normal, like, this is not the teaching anymore. He's gone. And my point is like, over the time, what I've noticed is like, I guess my point is this, is like, or and I'll tell one last story, like this is more close to the one you're actually asking. One time I was at this teaching by Lama Zopa Rinpoche also, and he had explained bodhicitta. He was teaching like for a long time, like hours on bodhicitta. And then there was this guy, and I knew the guy, he was kind of a mentally disturbed person who was well known in that center. And he said to Lama Zopa after like, maybe, I don't know, I can't remember exactly, but maybe Lama Zopa Rinpoche had taught for like 3-4 hours on bodhicitta. And the guy said, I don't give a crap about bodhicitta. Just give me something to eat, or give me something like, I don't care what your motivation is. Just give me what I want, And so Lama Zopa Rinpoche looked at him, I could see, with like all this compassion. And then he taught him personally about bodhicitta for like another hour. Like an hour, like he didn't just answer the question, like he went on for like an hour explaining to him the benefits of bodhicitta. It was quite beautiful, and then but then at the end, the guy came up and wanted to say more about his opinion about this. And Lama Zopa said, and then walked out. And I was like, he was done. Like, it was like, that was the end. And my point is like, for me, those were role model examples about like, and part of it is like, I guess I'm just saying, like, the Buddhist view is this, is life is infinitely precious. Our life is infinitely precious. We have this opportunity to become like, to evolve spiritually with this life. And we could die any moment. And really we could die tomorrow. It's like, and part of that I think is that's the model. In other words, it's like, so if there's something really, like, the idea in Buddhism on one hand is, you don't close your heart to anybody, but you also don't waste time. Because life is precious. And if you think like, and that's actually a Buddhist practice, right? If you think, if I were going to die tomorrow, would I spend it saying the same thing that I've said 15 times to the same person if I don't really believe it's going to do anything? And that, to me, that's why I told all those stories of the role models. Is the answer is, well, no, I would walk out. I would lovingly walk out. Because life is too short to spend it on something that's not meaningful. Now, it's different if it's meaningful. That's a different question. But does that answer the question? Like,
yes, it does.
And so it's really about impermanence.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions, actually?
No,
Do you have it? Go. Any other questions? So anyway, maybe I'll just say a little more. I mean, we still have a few minutes about this point that I want to say one other thing about boundaries also, like whether it's the walking out, like we were just talking about, or sometimes it's staying there but setting a boundary and approaching things differently. And but maybe I want to make another point about it, which is also, and I told those stories about the Lamas party, so I wouldn't use that for a second, is that I think for us also, sometimes setting healthy, compassionate, because part of boundaries is recognizing interdependence, right? So boundaries not, and that's why I said it's the example, like, I used it yesterday, I said it's like Martin Luther King Jr.'s point, right? Where you love the person, right? Like, I mean, I thought it was very, right? He said, I get that point, he said, don't come to the march if you don't love the person, if you can't have love in your heart for those we're disagreeing with or protesting against, then don't come. That was his point. Right? But also, boundaries take courage. And a part of that, I'll share it because I often think of this, for me personally, I often think of this story. It was a story of, it was actually regarding Martin Luther King Jr. I wrote about it in the Compassion book. So I'll paraphrase, I get the details right. But it was when he was a little boy, actually. He was in the car with his dad. So it was like Martin Luther King Jr. was like a little kid, and his dad was driving. His father was also a minister, and it was in Alabama. I won't find the page quick. Oh, it's okay. I can't remember what state. I was just trying to remember. It may have been, it was in the South, but I can't remember where. But, and so you can figure out what year it was. Right? It was well before the Civil Rights Movement. And a police officer, his father was a minister, and the police officer pulled him over, a white police officer, of course, pulled him over, and came up to the car and had his gun, and started saying, boy, boy, why'd you, whatever, boy, you were speeding, boy, and Martin Luther King, I visualized the scene, right? So Martin Luther King Jr.'s father looks at his son, and looks at this white police officer, and is being spoken to that way. And then he says to the police officer, something like, again, I'm not getting the wording right, something like, sir, I accept the ticket, but if you continue to speak to me in that way, I'm not going to speak to you, I'm going to drive away. And I thought, wow, like, he knew very well that was the moment where he could have gotten shot, right? Mm-hmm. And he said that anyway. And his son remembered that story the rest of his life and became who he became. And for me, I often think of that story because I think, wow, the courage of setting a boundary. Like, and that was so courageous, right, of him. And that also that boundaries come from self-respect, right, and from respect for others. That I'm gonna respect myself. And he also he didn't insult the guy, right? He said, sir. But then he said what was true for him. And that boundaries come from a place of respecting yourself and respecting others, and they take courage. And the reason why I'm saying that is, in our case, maybe there's a time where a boundary risks your life, but oftentimes it's much lower risk. It's the risk, that you don't want to say the boundary to somebody because they'll be upset with you. They won't like what you're saying. They'll judge you for it. They'll whatever. But if you don't do it, you're not respecting yourself, isn't it?
I have a question. In that case, you don't respect yourself, and that's part of your karma also. So it's part of your karma, no?
You mean how the person is treating you is part of your karma? If you're like, say it's your
exactly,
friend.
But the person is treating you, and you are being very, very nice with the people, but you still put the boundaries. Yeah. So maybe in the past, you suffered something like that, and you didn't do anything, you didn't say anything. So it's an opportunity for you also.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's, I guess, the point, isn't it? Is I think actually, because part of it actually is this, is like, Shantideva was making this point, right? It relates to what you're saying. Shantideva was making the point, actually, when the other person is doing something disrespectful or hurtful, they're creating bad karma, right? And it's connected to your karma. You have a karma with them, right? Maybe there was a process back and forth. Some past life you disrespected that. now they're disrespecting you, and you can disrespect. And actually, oftentimes it happens, right? Then you treat them disrespect, and then it goes on and on and on. And this is a judgment call, right? There are times where the best thing is to walk away and just to leave, if you can. There are other times where the best thing is to set a boundary for their sake and yours, right? To say, no, you can't treat me that way. And if you do, a boundary doesn't mean just you can't treat me that way. Actually, that's the other thing I think about that story, is he said, I'm not going to speak to you, and I'm going to walk, and I'm going to drive away. Right? A boundary means that you're owning your own power, right? That you're saying, here's what I'm going to do. It's not nothing, right? It's not just saying, I don't like it. Right? It's saying, I'll leave, or I won't speak to you, or I'll, whatever. There are many. It depends on the circumstance, and it has to be done a little bit skillfully, right? What do you have control over? You don't have control over everything, but I guess my point is that in that sense, then setting a boundary can be an act of love. And that's kind of, I think, what you're getting at, right? Where you're actually trying to help out of respect to yourself and respect to the other person. You're changing the pattern, and that can be huge. But it takes bravery oftentimes, doesn't it? But it is, it's changing the pattern, which changes. And if that's done out of self-respect and love, then that's a positive karma, right? And that's often, and it's funny, I think, I'll just say this point, a lot of times people feel like, it's funny, people feel, people feel like they have to be angry to feel powerful, right? I know people like that, where they feel like they have to get really angry and then they feel powerful. But the truth is when you're angry, actually, you're controlled by your anger. Actually, even from a neurological perspective, we're actually unintelligent when we're angry. Even smart people are stupid when they're angry because your brain isn't functioning properly. You don't see things accurately. And then you do things that end up hurting yourself oftentimes. So actually we're not powerful when we're angry. And I guess my point is this, oftentimes the way to be empowered is what we're talking about right now, is to say, well, how can, sometimes it's walking away, and sometimes it's how can I set a boundary in this situation? How can I assert myself? And in a way, I want to go back to victory, offer the victory to others. Now I'll conclude with it, because I wanted to explain that verse, so this is all we can actually get to that. I forgot, because that's where we started. But, so I wanted to say, so sometimes so then it depends, what does it mean, give the victory to the other, right? So I think sometimes there are a lot of times where if it's something that's just petty, then the correct thing is, let the other person win. Because it's better spiritually for you, right? If it's just something petty, right? Another one is, if you're wrong, definitely give the victory to the other person, right? And that isn't always easy, right? But just quickly say, wow, actually, you're right, I'm wrong. It's totally my mistake. I apologize, and I'll correct it. Right? That's offering the victory, because you're wrong, and even if and then also if you're 60% wrong and they're 40% wrong, well, that's the right thing to do then, right? Because if you're more wrong than them, or if it's a close call, if it's 50-50, which is hard to admit, but then you just, actually you can give the victory to the other person, right? Also, if it's petty, and even if you're right, but it's petty, sometimes it's better to give the victory, right? If it's something not important. But then, if it's something that's important, and that's a pattern, and that's disrespectful, right? I actually think that then setting a boundary is still giving the victory to the other person. Does that make sense? Whereas you're setting a boundary, but you're trying to have them win also, right? They may not like it at the time, but in the long run, right? Because it's and you know that, right? If your child doesn't want to do their homework, and you say you have to do your homework, or you're not going to have this or that, you're actually trying to help them win, right? You're trying to give them the victory in the long run. You're not letting them not do their homework, but you're trying to help them win in the long run. So that's the same thing with a boundary, right? So if it's with a loved one, your family member, somebody, anybody in your family. Oftentimes, when you set a boundary, it's well, maybe. And actually, I want to make one last point about this, because oftentimes, that example with the child, right? I was thinking of I was talking about when we drove here, my sister's kids, right? I love them. I'm their uncle, right? But the truth is, I don't make them do their homework. I never have one. She does. I just get to have fun with them, right? And so I love them, but I don't but she's really the person. You know what I mean? who's benefiting them. You know, like, I mean, they like that I give them presents and play with them, but she's the one who really is. I guess my point is like, the person, if you're willing to be the person to set boundaries with somebody, that's really loving them. Does that make sense? If you're doing it the way we're talking about. Here, that's really offering them victory. Not in the moment, right? If somebody treats you with disrespect and you say, no, you can't treat me that way, and if you do, here's what's going to happen. At the moment, they may feel very uncomfortable and upset, but really, who else would love them enough to set them straight? Actually. Does that make sense? So then it's actually an act of love. So that's that. And to conclude, then, this, I mean, there are a lot of things about patience and anger, but I'll just conclude with this one last thing from Shantideva, and I'll stop. Shantideva makes a point. Let me, actually, maybe I have the verse number. Yeah, 14, 15. So I'll read this verse, and then this will conclude with this point. So Shantideva says, there is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance, through practice, right, through habit. So through becoming acquainted with small harms, I should learn to be patient and accepting greater sufferings. Who has not seen this to be so with small sufferings and small issues? And then it goes on from here. So part of the point here is this, is if you really want to develop these kind of qualities, right? And actually, it's interesting. That's where you really would have this feeling of, you know, what we say, like a precious treasure, you know. But you actually, so I think this is the last suggestion I'll make, is so you actually have to assess yourself and then think, okay, what's the level of a difficulty I can actually be patient with now? Does that make sense? Like I'm at this level now. And then you go look for that. Like practice it, you know what I mean? Until you get really good at that. That's what he's saying, right? And then you go, okay, now maybe I can get to this level, and then this level, and then this level. And what he's saying is, and actually, like, you know, there are stories of bodhisattvas who are like patient when somebody was killing them or something, you know, and again, like I said, you know, like the point is like, not that you're supposed to be at that level now. That's not the point. The point is if you're in samsara and you have lifetime after lifetime, someday you will be killed, actually, by somebody. You know, if you don't become Buddha first, and so the point isn't. It's not that you're trying to find suffering, but the point is start with little things. Does that make sense? With little annoyances and learn to be happy. Like, you know what he said? Like there, right? If you could actually have that experience, like, oh wow, like 3 months ago this would have really annoyed me, and now I can actually feel happy in my mind. It's still unpleasant, but I can feel like mental peace, and I've really made progress. You know? And then like you can get excited. Oh, I'll try another one, like one step further. You know, and then you start to feel like it's a precious treasure. Like, oh wow, this happened. This kind of person came along, and I can practice now. Then you see, oh, I made progress in that. And then you actually, you know, and that's why I guess where I conclude is, then you know your spiritual practice is real and it's moving forward. You know, and anything else is like, well, I meditated for whatever, I did a retreat. Well, I mean, that's good, but still, you don't really know. You know, but when you know, I would have gotten, and that's like, yeah, that's that friend, that my close friend, my best friend. That's often as they'll say, well, you know, 4 or 5 years ago, you would have been like screaming at that person, and now you were kind to them and like you were loving to them. Like that's, now we know there's spiritual progress. You know, like there's no doubt, right? Because that nobody can debate. Does that make sense? Or you can know for yourself with certainty that's real progress. Whereas the other parts are, I don't know, you hope there's progress. So I think then this is like a very deep practice that's exciting, actually. And you can see how you can become like, it's fun to develop patience. And that's like, that's where you have the practice of joyous effort. And actually they say that each of the perfections, you're supposed to practice all the perfections integrated with each perfection. Does that make sense? Like the generosity of patience would be actually that you're giving people the very huge gift of you not being annoying to them. You know, like and so on. Like, you know, what's the word? The ethics of patience is you're not using harsh speech and so on. It's like there is that all the perfections get integrated together. So in this way, you gain this kind of enthusiasm and joy, and like it really should be like that. Like it's fun to see if I can do it, like a challenge, and it's interesting, and I'm becoming more peaceful, right? And therefore the world's becoming more peaceful because I'm part of the world, and it's like, that's something meaningful. So